You make me laugh.
I'm glad to hear it.
Come on, then.
Everything's the wrong way around.
No. Good evening, and just 2 seconds. Got to turn the TV down. Um, just want to talk about tonight about mental illness, and I've got the wonderful Robert Luther Smith with me, and he's going to talk about a couple books. What I think the title I'm going to put down tonight is the myth of mental illness, because we all got myths about mental illness anyway. So over to you, Robert. Why
Well,
why the myth of mental illness?
there are two principal reasons why this guy wrote the book in 1960, and that is because you can't have a mental illness, because something mental doesn't exist in the real world. You can't hold it in your hands. In that sense, it's what they call metaphysical. And an illness is physical. So if you have a doctor and he says you're ill, you say, well, I know what the illness is. I mean, I don't know what the symptoms of a cold are, but we all know what various symptoms of flu may be, for example. And so you can see it. With something that is mental, you can't see it. And so therefore you can't have something that is mental and an illness. It just doesn't make any sense at all in the medical profession, for one thing. And the secondary issue is that what you see in somebody is purely subjective. And so it's actually, because I've done a lot of reading about it lately because of all this pandemic thing and all that, is that it really boils back to how doctors think about human beings. What do they see when they see a human being? And doctors basically don't believe that humans have a mind. Seems incredible, but that's what they think, because they're physiologists. They only know about physical reactions, the heart, the lungs, the intestines, the stomach. And so they think that everything is a physical reaction. And so that they don't believe there is a mental life. It's incredible, but it's true. And that became known as behaviorism. I don't know if you've heard of behaviorism. People tend to hear of behavioral scientists these days, which is a bit of a cover for behaviorists, and a guy called Skinner. And it's been a battle between behaviorists who don't believe humans think or feel. They just think they react. So if a human goes into any situation, all a human does is react. Now, most people, or a lot of people, would say, no, I don't. I decide what I'm going to do. I choose what I'm going to do. I can do this, I can do A, or I can do B, or C, or D. But the doctor would say, no, that you're just reacting to external stimuli. So if you're a doctor, you don't really believe in the mind. So therefore, how can there be a mental illness? And on the other hand, you can't have an illness of something that isn't physical. And this guy, Saz, was the first one to come up with the idea, and he wrote it in 1960. So, I mean, that's 60 years ago. It's been known for a long time. But people still go around saying, what is a mental illness? Or he's got a mental illness. When in fact, what Saz says, and I agree with him, is that you're just having problems, or one is just having problems with life, so that you're struggling to get through life. And sometimes life is just too much for some people to deal with, and they have simple problems with sorting their life out. And of course, the whole thing started off with psychiatry just battled with psychologists. And of course, the thing about psychiatrists is all they offer you is pills.
Right.
And they only really have 3 pills. And the three, there is only really one, which is benzodiazepines, which is a heavy, heavy sedative. And if anybody's been watching the news lately, they know they've got a terrible problem in Scotland. And a lot of this is just driven by people taking mixtures of strange drugs, not least benzodiazepines, so that psychiatry doesn't deal with what people are struggling with. It just gives you a pill to keep you calm.
Okay. So is mental illness a disease?
Well, what people like me would say is that there is no such thing as mental illness. The doctors have just decided that there is because it's convenient for them. For example, schizophrenia, that word was made up in 1911 by a guy called Bloiler.
Right.
He just decided to call it that, I think, to frighten the hell out of his clients' parents, probably. So there are a lot of myths about the medical treatment of mental health. And of course, nobody wants to get to see a psychiatrist, as far as I know. Nobody would want to go to a psychiatric hospital, that's for sure, which is why we're now calling it well-being.
Right.
So it's not a question of whether you're ill or not, it's a question of whether you're happy or not. And for psychologists, it's a question of, are you happy?
Right. Okay. So how can we get help if we have got a problems with mental illness then?
Or mental health, let's put it like that.
All right then. Mental health then.
If we feel, well, the answer is you can't. There is nobody there. The only people in the NHS who deal with mental health in that respect are if you've been violent. If you've been violent, then they want to talk to you. But if you're just feeling down or depressed or sad or anxious or whatever it is you're feeling, they'll just either give you Seroxat or Prozac, as it's generally known, or they'll give you benzodiazepines, which will. So Seroxat supposedly lifts you up, and the evidence is it doesn't have any effect. It's a placebo effect. You've got benzodiazepines that are downers, so you've got uppers and downers. So Seroxat or Prozac, whatever you want to call it, is supposedly an upper. Benzodiazepines are a downer, so if you're feeling agitated, and then they have the so-called antipsychotics, which are just a mixture of the two. So it's mixture of Prozac or what they could selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they just mix them up. That's all they've got. So psychiatrists will just come in and look at you and say, well, you're anxious, take benzodiazepines, or you're depressed, take Seroxat. With a psychologist, they would start looking into your life experiences, but there aren't any. You know, there are very, very few psychologists available. In the what?
Have you ever been in a psychiatric unit?
Safe?
Right. Have you ever been
Psychiatric?
Yeah.
Oh, I've been through them, and I mean, the local one around here is St. Anne's. But if you go in there, and most people are just exhausted or tired people. You know, there's nothing actually wrong with them. They might have had a bad incident or something unhappy happened to them, but they're not ill in the sense of, you know, if you've got chronic liver disease. Then what Saz would say is that they're just exhausted from the problems of living. And so mostly they just need to rest. But that's all that goes on. I mean, a psychiatrist only comes in to see people once a week for half an hour. I mean, what can you find out about anything in half an hour? So it's really the senior nursing staff that provide the care, and I mean, they're very good, and they are generally understanding of the problems of living. And I think that that's the way that things are going. That's why it's called well-being now and mental health. And you never hear the word psychiatric mentioned. And in 5 years, psychiatric hospitals will disappear and there'll all be mental health clinics or well-being clinics, because it's about being happy. I think we discussed earlier, didn't we, last week or something, off screen, but either you're happy or you're unhappy. If you're happy, you haven't got anything to worry about. If you're unhappy, then it's either because something in your environment, either a thing or a person, is making you unhappy, or it's something in your unconscious that's making you unhappy. And I think that one of the biggest problems is that we've forgotten about the unconscious. And although I'm not a Freudian, he was the one that popularized knowledge of the unconscious. And I think, personally speaking, I think the problem is that people don't examine the unconscious, which is, by the way, all the unconscious is memories that you don't remember that you've got.
Right, okay. I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act.
Right.
Right? Around about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. And I went into acute unit. Now, do you know what acute unit is?
Acute unit, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was in acute unit for around about 3 months.
Yeah.
All right. Because I tried to take my own life.
All right. I'm sorry about
that. Right. And the trouble is, when I was in there, I had a nurse with me, and I saw a psychiatrist like nearly every day. Okay, now I agree with you now, because when I tried to commit suicide again about a couple of years ago, right, the psychiatrist only came in about twice a week, right, and they can only tell you, they can't really tell you what's wrong with you. They can only assume what's wrong with you. All right. And the trouble is, only person who knows about yourself is yourself.
That's right.
All right. And when I try to explain to him about that, I wanted to take my own life, that I wanted to jump off a bridge, things are going through it. He said, well, that's your problem. Get on with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. Psychiatry is a broken business, and correct. Why psychiatry is doing more harm than good, and that's 2013. It's the follow-on to SAS. There's something called the DSM. Have you heard of the DSM?
Go on, carry on.
Well, most people haven't. This is the thing. And this was invented in 1952, which is when they decided what the mental illness is. I don't agree with the mental illness idea, but I think there were about 9 men. He describes it in the book. There were 9 men, one of them called Spitzer, and they decided what the mental illnesses were. And they just made a list of what the symptoms of the illnesses were. And so all they do, and that's called what we now call behaviorism, but they just tick off the boxes. It's what they call the tick box culture. So they just look at you and say, well, he looks depressed, or he looks anxious, he must be anxious. And they don't make any attempt to find out why, because they wouldn't be able to find out why, because they're chemists. Why would a chemist be able to talk to you about your personal life? What special knowledge does a chemist have? None. You need to talk to social psychologists or anthropologists, for example. Becker was a very famous, I suppose you call them psychotherapists. That's what you really need. The guy who wrote Crack, the book I just showed you, is a psychotherapist. but there are very, 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 very few of them because
No.
doctors don't like them because they haven't got although they have got control over them, they don't like people who appear to do better than they do. So there are very few psychotherapists around. They only deal with trauma. So if you've been in a horrible car crash or, you know, a horrible fire or, you know, something like that, then you're given some kind of therapy, pardon me. But if you're just feeling depressed or, you know, you feel at the end of your tether, they just don't know what to say because they have no experience of it. They only know about chemistry. They only know about chemicals. That's why psychiatry is no good and why it's coming to an end rapidly.
What did you think about the electric shock system then?
Oh, that's when I get that. This was the problem. Is that if you read the history of psychology, it's very interesting. But basically, what happened was psychology started first. And you've heard of Pavlov's
Yeah,
experiments with the dog?
yeah,
Well, this is that's what started this behaviorism stuff up about stimulus and response. And that's when they started setting up these horrible experiments. They started off putting animals in cages, you know, and if you can remember all those horrible experiments they did on animals, and then they started extending it into humans. So you had electric shock therapy and lobotomy. I mean, if you've watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with
yeah,
Jack Nicholson, when they gave him a lobotomy, which is when you disconnect the front part of your brain from the rest of your brain. They just started experimenting, and I just find it terrible. It is true that sometimes electroconvulsive therapy works, but if you said sometimes an aeroplane works, would you get on a plane and fly to the
no,
south of France? No. So it's not scientific because if it were, it would work every time. But it
yeah,
doesn't. It works sometimes, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. So I'm not mad keen. Actually, funnily enough, a next door neighbour from many years ago had ECT, and it seemed to do them some good. But just recently, I heard of a case where she had another person had 16 doses of ECT and then committed suicide. So it's not scientific. And as they say in the book, Cracked, psychiatric diagnoses are scientifically meaningless. So there is no so-called mental illness that can be proven scientifically. It's just the opinion of the doctors. That's all it is. There's no evidence to back them up. There's no evidence to back up the existence of schizophrenia. There's no evidence to back up the evidence for depression, for example. In fact, I'll give you one example, and I'm sure it's a common problem with doctors, is they confuse exhaustion with depression. So let's have an example. Let's say you're a mother of 3, you're married, your husband is off and away, could be a long distance lorry driver, he could be a pilot or something, and you're having to look after 3 kids. Your husband doesn't do anything to help. You know, your mother's got cancer, your father died when you were 3, and you just got to cope with life. And sometimes it just gets too much. You get exhausted. And so you'll go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I just feel so terrible. You know, I can't get," and they'll just give you Prozac. That doesn't solve the problem.
no,
In fact, if you believe the statistics from Cracked, the book I just showed you just now, Prozac only has a placebo effect, which, as I'm sure you know, just means that because you're taking something, it makes you feel better because you think you're doing something about it. But it has no direct, definite effect. The only one that does is benzodiazepines, and they knock you out.
yeah.
Terrible things.
Do you
So
think we're doing enough? Do you think we're doing enough for mental for well-being and or mental health?
So you have to see, it's the line, bit foggy. So again,
Yeah, sorry. Do you think we're doing enough for mental illness?
we're doing.
Do you think we're doing enough?
Oh, right. Doing enough for mental illness? No, I don't. But that's given the fact that I don't think mental illness exists, problems with living. What we need to have is that, I mean, certainly under the pandemic, I get the sense that everybody's quite exhausted now. And when you get exhausted, you get irritable, you get annoyed, maybe you get angry, maybe you start drinking too, blah, 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 blah. And what we need is walk-in hubs where you don't have psychiatrists, you have preferably social psychologists, because a lot of these psychologists are not actually psychologists, they're actually behaviorists. And I think if you listen, you hear about behavioral science and behavior and behaviors with the S on the end, which doesn't exist as a word. There are these, all they're trying to do is change your behavior. What you need to do is be able to express your thoughts and put your thoughts into perspective. I mean, you've got to think, my mother's 102 and in bed in the room next door. She went through World War II. Now, that was a pretty shocking event. My grandparents went through World War One and World War II, and nothing ever affected them. They were completely what we call resilient. So a lot of what is needed in terms of mental health is forget about mental illness, just think about mental health. And one of the main things for mental health is resilience, being able to take the blows that life delivers. So, I mean, I've been fairly lucky. I'm the luckiest, one of the luckiest people to have my mother as my mother, because I had, had an easy time one way or another. But nevertheless, I've had blows.
Right.
So it's how do you respond to blows, and you need to have somebody with social experience, social knowledge to talk about, and that's what they need, and currently it doesn't exist.
Right. Okay. Do you think people get left? Do you think people get left for their own devices while being in hospital?
Do I think people?
Get left for their own devices?
Yeah. Yeah. They don't do anything. I mean, I can't, this is a fact. They don't do anything about mental health issues because they can't do anything. They haven't got the people to do it. The only people they have to deal with mental health issues is if you've been violent. Then they are legally obliged to do something about it. But if you're feeling depressed, or which is probably exhaustion, or if you have been through something difficult in your personal life, they will just say to you, got to get on with it. Take this. Either they'll give you benzodiazepines or Prozac, and they'll say, come and see me in a month's time. Well, what good does that do? None.
Well,
And this is,
they section me and then they said just take some antidepressants and that's it.
well, it's a bit of a, I'm not sure I heard that right, but
Yeah, so I said what they did was they sectioned me for 3 months, then they discharged me on antidepressants.
yeah, and antidepressants don't do anything.
No.
In fact, calling them antidepressants is a bit of a, well, the thing about doctors is that they want to medicalize everything, and they want to sell you pills. Just because it's the NHS doesn't make it any different to 100 years ago, when you had chemists and pharmacists and apothecaries trying to sell you one thing or another. Snake oil. Nothing has changed. They just, the big pharma, we all know what big pharma is, right? They just want to sell you pills. And, I think when I checked, Prozac was £64 a month. It was the only one I checked at the time. But, it's money. They want you to take it, but they haven't got any answers for people's problems with living. They just don't have them. There are people that can deal with it, but The psychiatrists don't, the doctors, which is what psychiatrists are, they don't want people interfering on their patch. They want to sell you drugs. They probably think you're lacking resilience. You should pull yourself together, that kind of idea. I'm not saying all doctors are like that, but even if they aren't like that, there are no resources to give you. They can't send you to anyone. There's no one to send you to. Or if there is, there's an 18-month waiting list. It's I wouldn't say it's a disaster in the sense of, I want to blow it out of proportion, but it's just no good, is it? I mean, as it happened in my early life, doesn't matter now, but my mother got married, and it wasn't a, he was just, the guy she married had his issues. And because we could afford it, we went to a private clinical psychologist. Which is what started me on my interest in psychology beyond. He taught me about Freud and psychiatry, and he warned me against psychiatry. That was 1970. But, that was the case, that unless you had the money to do it, you don't get any help unless you're being violent. And it's still the same to this day. They just want to sell you pills. It's the easiest thing for them to do, and it makes them money. They make more money by giving you pills than they do by sitting talking to you for an hour every week. They wouldn't talk to you. I mean, they need to talk. You need to talk to someone for at least an hour. Well, an hour a week would probably be sufficient. But the doctors aren't going to do it because they don't know anything about it. All they know about is chemicals. And as for the psychologists, they're mostly sent into like health psychology, like obesity and diabetes and smoking. So that they give out CBT. If you've heard of that, most people have heard of that now.
Yes, I have.
So it's anyone can cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just a flashy name for trying to change your behavior, and they're very obsessed with behavior and behaviors, as I said. And I mean, if somebody wants to smoke, they're going to smoke. If somebody wants to drink, they're going to drink, unless you approach what they think about it. And they just don't know how to evaluate what people think about. Excuse me. Because they don't have enough social psychologists. You need to have social psychologists who understand history, anthropology. For those that don't know about anthropology, it's culture, what we call culture now. We don't want to say the complicated word anthropology, so we say culture. So what's your culture? What's your history? And to a large extent, sociology. Those are the subjects that we can deal mental health issues or well-being with, because most of it is caused by, like that example of the lady I gave you, is that she's struggling to live. She's exhausted. She's tired, quite understandably. Nobody would be surprised that she's got 3 kids, got a mortgage to pay, got to cook for 3 kids every night. I wouldn't want to have to do that. I can cook for 1 in my time, but and all the rest of it, getting them to school. Maybe the husband does live at home and just isn't very helpful, the sort of thing. She goes and speaks to the doctor. Well, what can he do? There is nobody to send you to unless you've got the cash, of course. And I mean, it can be very expensive. £180 an hour, something ridiculous like that. And that's just
420 on Harley Street.
420.
Yeah, on Harley Street. Yeah.
In Harley Street, yeah. I mean, ridiculous amounts of money. Normal, everyday people can't afford that. So, we really need to have a massive push in creating more real psychologists, not behaviorists. And I mean, I could get onto a whole hour talking about the rise of behaviorism. It's quite an interesting story, but a lot of they call them psychologists, and they're not. They're sort of like animal trainers. They just want to change your behavior. A real psychologist talks about decision making, expertise, perception. Perception's extremely important in how we see the world and how we judge what's going on around us. Personality. Personality is massively important. What personality means is, what are the things that you particularly are good at or bad at that demonstrate the kind of person you are. So you've got perception, personality, social psychology that I've talked about. So that's history and anthropoculture. And then you've got cognition, which is the way we interpret the world, if you want, thinking. So there's a lot of aspects of psychology that behaviorism doesn't deal with. And we just haven't got enough real psychologists. But that is to say, people who are also good at social psychology. Because I believe personally that when somebody like the lady comes in who's exhausted and is asking help, needs to talk to a social psychologist about the ways of dealing with and the meaning of your life and where you stand in the world, perspective, for example, you know, knowing the history. Sometimes when you read history, you find out things and you think, oh my God. For example, I couldn't understand why my family had split up so much over the years. Why, instead of all living together in one sort of close location, everybody had gone all over the place. Until I was taught anthropology, and I discovered that that was a uniquely English characteristic and had been going on for hundreds of years. So I thought, oh, right. So I thought it was just my family splitting up, but it's not my family splitting up. All English families split up over time.
Yeah.
And so that gives you an explanation. So it's not so personal. You see, it's the culture. And so you think, oh, right. So I'm normal then, you know. And there are loads of things like that, which I mean, I've learned over the years, obviously. But if you didn't know that, for example, because if you go to South America, for example, or Africa, you know, families literally they're tribal, they stick together, they, you know, they're collectivists. They really occasionally you get, you know, you get a few of them coming over, you know, looking for a better life, etc., etc. But they live in family units. I mean, after all, monarchy in the original culture, you know, it was tribes, it was family units. And in England, that's all changed, and America now, of course. But in England, families started to split up and move all over the place, and that's perfectly normal. That's just the culture. And so we to have good mental health and well-being, you need to understand the culture you live in and your place in it.
Well done. Well done. Can we end there? Thank
Okay.
you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. That is really, really good. That was really, really good.
Thank you.
Brilliant. What we're going to do, we're going to catch up with Robert next week with some more bit about mental illness or mental health or well-being.
Mental health, well-being,
mental health, yeah. And we'll catch up with him. And don't forget, guys, if you've got any questions for next week, please come on, because Robert's going to be with us for a few weeks now, and he will talk about all different sorts of things. Thank you, Robert, for joining me. Brilliant. You're great out. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.